disability rights movement is about is advancing that principle that autistic people and all people with disabilities should have the right to be included in our communities and have access to the same rights as anyone else. I want to talk very briefly about one other thing that we're doing, just specific to the autism world. And we do a lot of things, but I'll talk about this, and then, I think I'll kind of say a few concluding remarks, and we'll have, 30, 40 minutes for questions. One of the problems that we've seen is that in the autism world, even as self-advocates are becoming more and more vocal, and we're seeing changes in the way that people talk about autism, we haven't seen changes in the way that people spend money about autism. And a lot of people are paying lip service to supporting or respecting autistic people, but they're not putting their money where their mouth is. When we founded ASAN, we were very clear. We see our goal as not just telling our stories, although telling our stories is important, but also having a say in the details of public policy and research and services, because details are where things are made or broken. And I think that is critically important in a lot of ways. In 2011, the most recent year for which we have statistics, the federal government spent $217 million on autism research. Would any of you like to guess what percentage of that $217 million was spent on research into improving the quality of services for autistic people?
2%.
Yeah, I was going to 2%.
4%.
2.45%. You're all in the neighborhood. You guys are more well-informed than most audiences I talk to. Most of the time when I talk to people, who aren't so familiar with the state of affairs in the autism world, they think it's much better. Anybody want to guess what percentage goes to research on the needs of adults?
1.45?
Very close, 1.5%. So it's 1.5% for adults, less than 2.5% for services, and a vast majority going towards things like causation, biology, etiology, things of that nature. So we've got a lot of money being spent in our name, but not a lot of money being spent for our benefits. And in fact, if you look outside of government, in the private sector, you see something very similar. Autism Speaks, remember that organization that has no autistic people on its board of directors, that talks about us without us, that in fact implies in its advertising that we'd be better off dead. Autism Speaks puts only 4% of money donated to it for services and supports to families. And if you look at where the bulk of Autism Speaks' money goes to, which is research, you'll find that their allocation of research dollars to services research and adult research is lower than the allocation we see from NIH. It's less than 2.5% and 1.5%. So what we have here is a situation in which a lot of money is being raised and allocated to the government for autism, for autistic people. But not a lot of money is being spent on the things we would want to see it spent on. And so a lot of what ASAN has been increasingly doing is working to call attention to this fact and lobby to change it. We've made a little bit of progress on changing where the government spends its money. Not enough. It's still very low. But they recently announced a new funding opportunity specifically for autism services and specifically for autism services around transition to adulthood, which we think shows signs that they're beginning to respond to our pressure. Groups like Autism Speaks are remaining the same as they ever was, and we think we need to continue to communicate who is and isn't working with the autistic adult community in that regard. But what we're aiming to do there, and what the neurodiversity movement has always aimed to do, is to ensure that when someone is talking about autism, autistic people have a right to respond and have a right to be present and have a right to have a place in the decision-making conversation. And that's really, it's the same right that any other minority community has always aspired to. About, I think, it was a year and a half ago, there was a tremendous tumult over the fact that, it was a quite justified tumult, tremendous, controversy over the fact that a House committee, I think the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, was holding a hearing on women's contraception with only men testifying. And most people realize this is kind of a problem here. End up with that. But most of the time that folks have talked about autism with only non-autistic people at the table or in the discussion, that has not been viewed with the same degree of controversy. We're starting to change that. When the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee decided to announce an autism hearing with no autistic people testifying, we managed to organize the community and put a lot of pressure, and we got representation from 2 autistic community leaders at that hearing. That was a definite victory. But we still see most of the conversation taking place without us. I want to close by, just sort of touching base on one thing. We, as autistic people, have a lot to contribute, not just to the national conversation on autism, but also to society writ large. How many of you have heard of something called the curb cut effect? So the curb cut effect it's an idea that sort of originated when they put in curb cuts, little inclines that make it easier for wheelchair users to access sidewalks, and they suddenly realized that anybody who needed to take a stroller up the sidewalk, or anybody who needed to take a luggage up the sidewalk, also benefited from this. And so the curb cut effect means something that was done for people with disabilities that actually benefits the population at large. How many of you have ever used captions? Okay. How many of you use Netflix? Okay. So Netflix is now required, and I think this is phasing in over time, but it will be required to put captions on all of its content because of litigation by the National Association of the Deaf. And ASAN has been trying to develop, with our partners in the autistic and broader communities, the idea of what is the equivalent to curb cuts and captions for autistic people. At Outreach, which is an annual conference run by and for autistic people, they have something called color communication badges. So if you're wearing a green badge, it means I want to meet new people, but I'm not sure I feel comfortable approaching them. So can you approach me if you see me wearing a green badge? That's an invitation for you to introduce yourself. If you're wearing a yellow badge, that means that, well, I want to talk to people I already know, but I don't feel comfortable talking to people I don't know. So don't approach me if you don't know me. If you're wearing a red badge, it means I don't want to talk to people. I feel overstimulated. But we think a lot of people could benefit from that kind of thing. We've been starting to talk with some college campuses and some other places, conferences and other settings, about introducing these color communication badges because it's good for autistic people. It makes our space more accessible. It makes space more accessible to us. But it's also good for the general public. I think a lot of college freshmen would love to have, the opportunity of putting on a green, yellow, or red badge every so often at orientation. I think a lot of people at conferences or events would benefit from that kind of thing. And so another aspect of neurodiversity, and one of the other things that I really charge you all to think about, is how can we take the things that we need for ourselves and use them as an opportunity to open up society for everyone, to create a more inclusive world. That's a big part of ASAN's mission. By the fact that you're all here, I know that that's a big part of your personal mission. And I really want to thank you all for coming and for giving me this time to spend with you. Thank you so much. Some people don't like the loud noise and clapping, so let's just do this.
Yeah. That's like a sign language for clapping.
Yes, yes. We took that from the deaf community.
I'm giving you an applause. So what's the badge for? I want to talk to you, but don't handshake it. This is how we do it?
That's an excellent point. That's an excellent point. We should develop one for that. Yeah. Okay, we got some questions. Let's take.
Do you think that, like, the broader autism community will ever be, you know, as full force as, say, the deaf or the blind?
I think so.
Could you repeat the question?
The question was, do I think the broader autism or autistic community will ever be as full force, as powerful, I think you meant, as the deaf community or the blind community? Did everybody get the question? Mm-hmm. You got it out there? Okay. I think so. The one thing to keep in mind is the National Association of the Deaf was founded in the 1880s. And the National Federation of the Blind was founded in the 1940s. And actually, a lot of the issues that they dealt with in their early years were very similar to the issues that we dealt with. How many of you have heard of Alexander Graham Bell? Dude invented the telephone, right? Okay. Alexander Graham Bell was also a major proponent of eugenics, particularly against the deaf. And one of the big early priorities of the National Association of the Deaf, not in 1880, but in the early 20th century, was to push back against Alexander Graham Bell and his allies' attacks against sign language. Bell believed that sign language and other aspects of deaf culture were bad because it might encourage deaf people to breed with each other, and as he saw it, it might lead to the emergence of a, quote, different and defective variant of the human race. He wrote this in a report to Congress in which he called for a ban on deaf marriage. And so you kind of see some parallels. The early 20th century, the early deaf community had to deal with people talking about them without them, too. The early deaf community had to deal with people who thought that the goal of advocacy around deafness should be to create a world without deaf people, or where deaf people were considered indistinguishable or looked indistinguishable from their peers. Jacobus Tenbrook, the founder of the National Federation of the Blind, who started NFB, the National Federation of the Blind, in the 1940s, wrote about his problems with the service providers in the blind community. He said, in their haughty disregard, quote, in their haughty disregard for the opinions of the organized blind, they betray a colonialism that ignores the revolution in welfare and civil rights. Tenbrook was talking about, at least in part, sheltered workshop operators. In the 50s and the 40s, 50s, and 60s, sheltered workshops served a lot of blind people. In fact, historically, workshops have served whoever the population generally believes isn't fit enough to be included in the workforce, or we don't know how to support them in integrated workforce settings. So you saw the blind community, too, face a lot of the same issues that the autistic community did. And so what we've got to be thinking about now is, how do we organize like those communities do? We have the leaders of ASA in Sacramento here, and I really want to encourage you to connect with them, leave them your email, and think about how you can play a role in the autistic self-advocacy movement here in Sacramento and in California. Because if we're going to get to the point where the deaf community and the blind community and other disability communities are today, we have to be investing the time and the effort into advocacy and organizing. It is possible. it will take some time.
So, what, you said Oregon, and you said New York, what was the other state you said earlier?
Massachusetts,
Oh, nice.
Oregon, and New York have announced that they'll be phasing out sheltered workshops across time. We probably don't want them to do it overnight because we want time to support people in integrated jobs. And Vermont has done so since 2003.
Good
Question all the way in the back. I want to get to you.
Yeah, the hearings in Congress on SSDI reform, are you following those and giving input?
So the topic of SSI and SSDI is one we're very interested in, and we're concerned by some of the attacks being made against SSI and SSDI beneficiaries. SSI, just so everybody's aware, stands for Supplemental Security Income. It's disability support payments. Some of you may have them or be familiar with them. Typically, SSI is for people who haven't been in the workforce before or haven't been in the workforce to a considerable degree. SSDI is Social Security Disability Income. It's disability support payments for those that have been in the workforce previously. We're concerned by people who are trying to make it out to seem like people are defrauding these programs. You know, we think, well, fraud exists in any public program. There's not evidence to suggest there's widespread fraud in these programs. I do think it's our view that many people who are currently on SSI or SSDI could work if given access to the right supports, the right health care, and, you know, employers that are willing to be accommodating. And so, you know, we do not make statements like people on SSDI or SSI, you know, are too disabled to work. We don't subscribe to that point of view. At the same time, we don't think the way to get people into the workforce is to kick them off the disability rolls and tell them to fend for themselves. We think the way to get people in the workforce is to publicize programs like the Medicaid buy-in, to expand access to supported employment services, and to help educate employers about accommodations in the workplace. Does that answer your question, sir?
Well, a lot of it. But the flip side of it is the website like Autism Now and the partnerships between the ARC and various federal agencies, what you guys are doing with regard to that.
With regards to the Autism Now collaboration?
Yeah.
So our focus in Autism Now is a little bit, and Autism Now is a grant to a consortium of organizations that ASAN is a part of, and so is the ARC of the United States. Our focus in Autism Now isn't related to the Social Security program. What we've been producing in Autism Now are resources on higher education, employment, relationships and sexuality. We recently produced a guide for newly diagnosed autistic people, both adults and adolescents, called Welcome to the Autistic Community. And we also provide some webinars for that collaboration. All the way in the back.
Yes. In California, we have a lot of mandated programs for people who are autistic. But the same problem is the state legislators do not fund those programs. Would you be willing to come back to California and talk to our legislators? And also in our community in Sacramento, there are many faith-based facilities that would love for you to come in and talk to our local community.
Sure, be in touch. I'll leave you with my contact information before I leave. Time permitting and resources permitting, I would love to see if we can make that happen.
And respectively, what has been accomplished in California and legislatively wise, where are the committees that we should be paying attention to and talking to?
So that's an excellent question. I'm not familiar with the details of California's policy situation, but there are a couple of common themes that we see nationally. The State Developmental Disabilities Council is very important to connect with. The State Protection and Advocacy Agency is very important to connect with. California has, I believe, a number of committees on autism at the regional level. ASAN is about to have a very significant presence in California. So this time next year, I'll know a lot more. We were recently awarded a grant by the Administration on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities to set up something called the Pacific Alliance on Disability Self-Advocacy. And what the Pacific Alliance is, aside from a convenient excuse to name a federal grant out of something that sounds like Star Wars, I picked the name, but what the Pacific Alliance really is it's a technical assistance center we're going to be running for self-advocacy groups that are looking for advice in California, Oregon, Washington, and Montana. So we've recently just gotten it started. We've spent the last few months getting things set up, and if any of you want to contact the Pacific Alliance to learn about how you can connect with resources about what your self-advocacy group can do to play a bigger role in policy, please let me know, and I'll connect you with the people in ASAN who are running that. In the back.
Yes, hello. I really liked what you were mentioning earlier about finding jobs, especially for disabled, especially for people who haven't worked yet, because one of the things that's always been a major hassle for me is that not only am I autistic, I also have a severe medical problem with severe physical pain every time I wake up in the morning. For the past 10 years I've had a chronic migraine disorder that especially attacks me, especially right when I wake up. I have to rush right to the bathroom, take some pills, get something to drown the pain out, use some ice and stuff like that. In fact, it's been bugging me through most of the meeting. I've had to go into the kitchen several times just to get some more ice every time it was melting, just something to dull the pain out. And so because of that, it's been very difficult to, find a job. And since I haven't worked yet, and since I'm currently going to community college and living with my parents and my brother, I've been, trying to figure out some way that I can, find some way to cope, get a job, despite my severe disabilities. So what exactly can I do to find those types of people that, can, work with people like me, that, with my physical limitations and severe pain?
That's an excellent question. So there are a couple of systems that work to support people with disabilities that are looking for jobs or looking for support in general. The most comprehensive system, which not all autistic people are eligible for, is the Medicaid developmental disability system. I think in California it's run by regional centers under the Lanterman Act, if memory serves. The challenge is that not all autistic people qualify for services under the Medicaid developmental disability system, and that presents a really significant challenge. If you do qualify for those services, you might want to look into something called supported employment. And supported employment basically can include a lot of things, but it might include, for example, support to try a few different jobs and go through a process called discovery, where you try a few different kinds of job sites and learn what you might be good at or interested in. It might include job coaching services to help you learn how to do particular tasks, or to help you communicate with your employer about what kinds of accommodations you might need, like flexible hours, which sound like they might be useful, given some of the things you described. It might also include something like job carving services or customized employment. And customized employment, and job carving is a kind of customized employment, is something that's often very useful because it basically consists of a person with a disability and an employer getting together and saying, the employer has some specific needs, the person with disabilities has some specific skills, how can we match those up and design a job that works with that person? If you don't qualify for Medicaid developmental disability services or the regional center services in California, there's also a state system called vocational rehabilitation. And very often vocational rehabilitation, I can't speak for how it is in California or in this part of California, but very often vocational rehabilitation leaves a lot to be desired in terms of understanding autism and autistic people. It sometimes is worth connecting with anyway, just because you may get a good provider, you might get a good VR counselor, and it's another option that's out there.
Thank you.
A third possibility I would mention very quickly is there are centers for independent living across the country, and particularly in California,
Centers for Independent Living.
and they might be able to connect you with more resources.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that.
My pleasure. Thank you for your question.
You're welcome.
Andy?
How does the self-advocate sort of obtain information about what's going on in, particularly at the state and local level? Because I see national tackle a lot of issues that happen on the national level, and I'm just wondering how we can kind of scale that down to state and local politics, and how people sort of obtain the philosophy, the savvy, the history.
That's an excellent question, and to be honest, it's one of the hardest things that we're struggling with right now. The larger disability rights movement built an infrastructure on a state-by-state level over decades. It took a very long time, and in some states it's still not very strong. The autistic self-advocacy and the neurodiversity movement is really just starting to build infrastructure at the state and local level. And so one of the things we really need to do is to partner with state and local disability rights groups to try and learn the lay of the land, get our people more experience with that kind of advocacy. And so we're trying a few different ways of doing that. First, the Pacific Alliance is going to be providing technical assistance and producing resources and doing webinars for self-advocacy groups in California, Oregon, Washington, Montana. We haven't announced it yet, so you guys heard it here first, but soon we're going to be announcing for either March or February, I can't quite remember, a series of webinars on fundraising for self-advocacy groups, which is a topic that many self-advocacy groups are very interested in. After that, we're going to be doing some on access, and we're also going to be releasing some materials on meeting facilitation and other topics. Public policy is probably going to come after that. In addition to that, there are many state-based training opportunities. Have any of you ever heard of something called Partners in Policymaking? Okay, so Partners in Policymaking, I don't know if they have it here in California.
Yeah, they do.
They what? They do, excellent, so they do. Partners in Policymaking is this training that started in Minnesota, and a lot of state developmental disability councils run it. And basically, it takes self-advocates and parent advocates and gives them training. It's usually one weekend a month over the course of about 11 months on how to be effective policy advocates and how to influence public policy. It's a great program. I highly encourage it. We're also starting to develop some state-based programming. There are going to be 2 examples of ASAN state leadership development programs in 2014. We're going to be doing a Pacific Leadership Academy. It'll be small at first. It's going to be 15, 20 people at most, and that's from 4 different states. So you'll get maybe 3 or 4 people in California, and we're going to need to spread them out across the state and across different kinds of self-advocacy groups. The Pacific Alliance is not just for autistic self-advocates, but we hope to have some representation from ASAN chapters here in California. And that's going to focus on how to be an effective leader in self-advocacy organizations. We also are going to be doing a State Leadership Academy in Tennessee, which is going to focus very specifically on the employment first movement in Tennessee. And that's it's our hope that we'll replicate that in other states later. So I would encourage you to check out Partners in Policymaking, to find other disability rights organizations that have a strong presence at the state and local level, and to play a role, as I know you have in the past and continue to, with ASA and Sacramento as they work to grow and develop, over the course of the coming years. I believe we have someone in the back.